First, we will hear from Marie McAuliffe, who is the head of the Migration Research Division at IOM, who will explain the structure and goals of the Global Compact, but also how it fits within the broader understanding of global governance on migration. Marie, if I can start with you.
Thank you very much, Liz. And thank you very much indeed to Andrew and to Martin for the invitation to come and really step you through where we're up to at the moment with the Global Compact and what that means for the future, and also what that means for data research and analysis, particularly given that we're here at the Migration Policy Centre at EUI. It's an important aspect to look at. Just picking up on what Liz was talking about in terms of the nod to GCIM, one thing as we go through and we talk about the two compacts, and Claire will be talking about the GCR and I'll be talking about the GCM, is that unlike GCIM, which was a UN review, it was a UN review process, what we've got occurring with the GCM, the Global Compact for Safe, Orderly, Regular Migration, is at the same time there's also a UN reform system process going on, and it's being done in alignment. So we'll talk about that a little bit later in the presentation. There are some sort of early insights, but the Deputy Secretary General, I understand, is briefing member states on the UN reform process and the next steps tomorrow. So we'll hear more about that in the next couple of weeks. Where am I pointing? I'm pointing somewhere. Thank you.
You just point that at me and then I'll...
Yeah, that's great. Magic. Wonderful. That's called international cooperation or something like that. Right. The background, as Liz mentioned, there was the declaration in 2016. This is where I've got right the way through the presentation, the little nods to the UN reform process. So IOM became a UN-related organisation at the same time at General Assembly. The modalities resolution, these are very process-oriented, but they're important, actually, in terms of how it's being done. The GCM phases, consultation, stock-taking, we are in intergovernmental negotiations. Not right now because they'll be sleeping in New York, probably, but intergovernmental negotiations are actually on this week. They're on now. And they will be concluding in July. I'm trying hard. It's not.
Sorry. I went into sleep
International cooperation's broken down already. Okay. Let's not be ahistorical. I've really just put this in as a bit of a reminder. It goes back a long way. And as Jean-Christophe said this morning, there are a lot of expectations around the Global Compact, but let's be realistic. Let's be realistic in terms of where we've come from. GCIM obviously is a critical part of that. But there are a lot of regional, global, different types of processes that have fed in on specific issues, the Nansen Initiative, so on and so forth, that have fed into where we are now. And I think it's important to acknowledge those and also acknowledge some of the changes. So very early on in the process, just after the declaration was adopted, we commissioned a researcher to do a comparative thematic mapping, and we'll go back and have a look once the final text is concluded, and I think we already are seeing definitely strong kind of expectations about where the divergences and convergences are. We're seeing those play out now in intergovernmental negotiations. Thanks. And just go on to the next one. It's a long list. That table is a long table, and that's not all of it. So if we can just go to the next slide, would be great. Key aspects. The first, the big one, and I'm telling people what they already know, but this is a non-binding state-led process. This is quite important within the context of migration and global governance of migration. It is very much focused on principles and commitments, and we can have a bit of a discussion probably in the Q&A in terms of how that has manifested itself, particularly with the current revision, which is revision 2, released a couple of weeks ago. Very strong focus on people-centred and human rights-based. That comes out through the text. It came out in the declaration. It continues to be a strong focus, but while also recognising what I would call state sovereignty. The big issue that I think a lot of people are grappling with, although there is a stronger sense now that we have some of the compact text really taking shape, that we have to be consistent with, target 10.7 for the SDGs, that this is a big agenda and migration is one part of it, but an important part. There is actually quite a lengthy document on IOM's vision. I thought it would be quite useful for you to see some of the key elements and how IOM fits in. I'll talk a little bit in process terms, how IOM fits into the Global Compact. It's very different to the GCR, so we'll talk about that with Claire in a moment. But this is IOM's vision in terms of content, in terms of framing, in terms of emphasis is how I would put it. I'm not going to read it out, but I would also encourage you to have a look at the full document, a much lengthier document, of course, that's on the website. State-led, UN-supported, but migrant-inspired. And this is something that I think we need to be very mindful of. It is coming through in the negotiations. It was very strong in the consultation phase. It will be critically important to implementation. And there is acknowledgement, that very clear acknowledgement when we talk about implementation and follow-up in the text, the need to involve migrants, the need to involve cities, the need to involve academia, the need to involve the private sector and so forth. We wouldn't really be sitting here if 2015 and the large flows hadn't occurred, and this is, and certainly picking up on Miriam's really very good presentation earlier this morning, in terms of social psychology, one could, and it would be interesting to see some research on this, interpret the global community's response and member states and others from different sectors' response to reassuring people that we are managing this situation. We do acknowledge that it's very important. Safe, regularly, orderly migration, or unsafe, irregular and disorderly migration, that it does need a response, and that response does need to come from international cooperation. UN support, just very quickly, I'm not going to read those out, but there's been a lot of UN support at the same time as the state-led process. There's also been CSO input, including from academia and certainly via a range of different UN mechanisms, which we'll talk about later. IOM has been jointly servicing the full GCM process, providing technical and policy expertise, and that is clearly laid out in the modalities resolution, for example, in terms of process. Intergovernmental negotiations, they're in today. They conclude tomorrow. The final session will be in July. Rev 2, as we call it, Revision 2, was released very recently ahead of this session. What we've seen is the document move from like 24 pages, 27 for several versions, and then this Rev 2, which is actually the fourth version. There was 0 draft, then 0 draft plus, and so on. So Revision 2 is now 33 pages. There is a lot more content, and there has been a shifting. What I mean by that is we've got one new objective, that's Objective 23, specifically laying out international cooperation. But each objective has changed slightly because we've got a commitment statement, which is 2 or 3 sentences, followed by then and I've got very careful language there, range of actions considered to be relevant policy options and best practices. I have interpreted that as a menu, acknowledging that migration does not work in the same way in different geographic and geopolitical locations. So it is tailored to best fit. Implementation is certainly, we'll have a discussion, I'm sure. We'll get some great questions from people. Strong focus on capacity building, quite rightly. There is nods to the Secretary-General's decision on the UN Migration Network that IOM will coordinate and be the Secretariat for. That is going to be briefing of Member States tomorrow. There's also very importantly, I think, a role of state-led processes and global processes like GFMG and the various RCPs, regional cooperative processes. And then I've highlighted in red, particularly for us who are involved and interested in the links between policy and research, cooperation and partnerships with a range of actors. Academia is definitely included in that, but a range of different partners to implement. Now, in terms of process around GCM follow-up, and this gets quite a few questions, it is being formulated within the context of the negotiations, but we do have some clarity now in Revision 2 around the high-level dialogue on migration becoming the International Migration Review Forum. That will be held every 4 years, but then the alternate sort of 2 years will be a focus on regional processes. This is something that's come out quite clearly within the consultation and the negotiation processes, that we do need to be very mindful of the regional dynamics around migration, importantly. Very strong, again, a nod to the state-led processes, RCPs and GFMD, and again in follow-up, And we need to work out how that is going to actually manifest itself, but cooperation and partnerships with a range of actors. This, I think, for people that have been working on UN, and I used to say the glacial pace of UN reform, will know that we've seen this change, the last 20 to 30 years, and it has had varying degrees of success, but it's really critical to migration, because migration is transnational and there's agency involved in all of those different actors. So we've got to be really pulling those people in. They are the ones that will actually be doing the implementation alongside states. Intersections with GCR. Claire and I had a nice discussion on the bus this morning. What we're seeing, and what we're certainly seeing within the UN, the broader sort of system, is now that there is more clarity on text around the Global Compact, it's real. So we're seeing that there's definitely recognition of separate processes, but working much more towards a coherent approach, with the centrepiece and the focus being on making sure people don't fall between the cracks. So the real key is going to be in implementation, and a lot of agencies, a lot of UN agencies are working together on this and acknowledge this at different levels of the system. So I'm actually very pleased, and I think everybody is pleased, that with this focus on people not falling between the cracks and making sure that we've got the separate processes aligned, that we'll be able to really do something quite good in this area, especially around implementation. Convergence and divergence, we hear this a lot. It was the centrepiece and the construct that we asked the researchers to do the very early work on the sort of mapping exercise. And it has worked out, very similar terms to what we had sort of expected. There is very strong engagement of states throughout the process, with one exception, of course, but very, very strong engagement. And I'll show some questions right at the end that I get asked all the time, one in particular, that we can talk about. But this has become very critical during negotiations. Member states are taking it seriously, they're fully engaging in it, and that, I think, really is a very positive outcome for the compact. And I think we will have a compact, and that it will be adopted at the conference, and we'll be able to take it forward. There are many areas of convergence, and I can't list them all. The areas of convergence are much, much, much larger than the areas of divergence. And I've been very careful with the language here in terms of divergence. It's divergence and or extra discussions. So some areas that really they needed to have extra discussions in intergovernmental negotiations to work through. Some of those are now sort of irrelevant. They have worked their way through. They have resulted in text within the actual compact itself. Again, careful wording. This is from the co-facilitators who are managing the process. Differentiation between irregular and regular, differentiation between migrant and refugee, and then the topic or thematic areas where they had extra discussions. There are no real surprises there, partly because a lot of those do cross over different areas, different geopolitical areas, and also the differences between the two compacts as well. For us, I've added this slide. Data research and analysis. We all feel this. We're all keenly interested in it. I did a find in the document to pull kind of everything out. I haven't touched everything. There's a lot more in there, but just some highlights. Consultation and stock-taking phases, and no surprises there. Wheel in the experts, wheel in the researchers, the academics, the practitioners, to talk about knowledge, to talk about findings and potential unintended consequences of what might occur under a compact. It's very, very important, and states are very keen to listen. In terms of the objectives, there are some very clear nods to data research and analysis, and I haven't pulled out all of them, I've just pulled out the main ones. Migration data and research is objective number 1, which I find very interesting. I've worked in migration for too long. And I normally find that at the end. It's usually objective 22, 23. So it's really good to see the data and research aspects right up the front. There's an interesting one on academic mobility within the regular pathways section. And then there's quite a strong focus on contributions to migrants and diaspora, and the knowledge and the research and analysis to support that. There's also very, very clear kind of nods to a range of different inputs from different areas, including of key researchers. And then there's also the nod to the implementation and follow-up. Academia is clearly listed along with a lot of other players in terms of capacity building and collaboration. I'm not really going to read them out. I'm just going to let you look at those. Put one in red. And we can talk about those a bit later. I get asked all the time the first one. And you know, I do understand why people think, okay, it's not binding, it's not a treaty, you don't have to come up and stump up to, you know, do a UPR, Universal Periodic Review within the UN system. But times have changed, and I think that the UN system reform process, as well as the Global Compact, acknowledges that. A state will be signing up to the commitments in there and then looking at the actionable kind of policy best practice examples. But it's not up to states anymore, and arguably, it's certainly the emphasis previously was more state-centred because of regulatory regimes and so forth. But now, in this environment, with this technology, with the amount of input and information that we have from a range of different sectors, that's no longer viable. So, of course, a non-binding nature, if you are a state and you've committed to it, the international system and the follow-up and review is one thing, but CSOs, academia, NGOs, migrants groups, the private sector, they're the ones that are going to be holding you to account, quite rightly, for the commitments that you've signed up to. So part of that is around partnership. Part of that is about being accountable in different ways through different systems, including political systems. So this morning's discussion was very useful and very interesting in terms of public attitudes. It does mean that states are committed and they are taking it seriously and they are taking the intergovernmental negotiations seriously. But I'm quite confident, I wasn't quite so confident earlier, but I'm much more confident now that we will have a compact and we will have a very, very large number of states sign up to it. So we'll see. I might be proved wrong, but I wasn't quite so confident before. I think the last few months has really been very, very useful and very interesting in terms of the intergovernmental negotiations and the comments and the interventions that states have made. There is a strong sense of very much needing to find common ground, where it exists, expanding it. And I think we'll see that play out through the implementation, both at the international level and also at the national level.
Great, thank you so much for taking us through that. It looks simple on the surface, and then you get one layer down and you realize the complexity of the actors involved, the different groups that have different inputs. And I think, you know, from the outside, it can sometimes seem very difficult to get involved in a process. So at the same time, the Compact is talking about involving lots of new actors, but it is a Byzantine process. How do you actually manage to get into that? And I would be curious to know from your perspective, you know, leading on research at IOM, how do you bring actors in a transparent way, as opposed to, you know, the people who understand the system and know how to get their information from A to B, and there are a few of them, including on this panel. But and so how do you? Is there a need to formalize that? And I just wanted to push a little bit on the non-binding nature. We hosted a closed roundtable with Louise Arbour, who is the special representative in March, with the migration policymakers who are not involved in the negotiations, that is to say, not the foreign policy guys, but the interior guys, who have a slightly different approach to these things. And one of the things that came out very strongly was we as a state would never sign up to anything we didn't have an intrinsic belief we wouldn't implement 100%. So it is binding to us if we're going to sign up to it. And there's a tension there between something that is, don't worry about this, it's not legally binding, and therefore asking people to sort of be open and collaborative. And then the belief that among many states have that regardless, it is a UN document, it will be binding for us, and therefore we have to be very, very defensive about what we're willing to commit to within it. And do you think there's a way to navigate this effectively?
Certainly. I'll answer the first question very quickly first, and that is, it's wonderful to have the problem of having too many people that are interested in contributing. I mean, there are some really, really sharp minds, but there are some very big hearts. And to be able to have that problem, I think, is an absolute privilege. And it's a constant problem that we face, quite frankly, but it is a privilege. And to be able to manage the transparency is then about being an international civil servant and also a national civil servant, to be able to manage probity, to be able to manage accountability, responsibility, and the big one for me is obligation. So we take a lot of very careful consideration in that, including with the Migration Research Leaders Syndicate. I can sometimes, occasionally I'm criticised for doing policy research and being focused more on solutions rather than activism. And I understand that. I do think that there is a place for activist academics, but I don't think that that is a place for me nor for my institution or organisation to be involved in. I'm not saying it's not valid, it's certainly valid, but it's not something as an intergovernmental organisation, a UN agency, to be supporting activist academia. We need to be doing rigorous, balanced research and analysis, and that is a really critical criterion in terms of transparency. That is, because we play a long game, we're not playing a short game, and we're actually in the tent, using all these ridiculous idioms, aren't I? But there is responsibility, there is a sense of responsibility. I've done a lot of academic work, and I know that that is liberating and freeing in many ways, and it also allows for more creativity and innovation and so forth, and also including because you don't have to implement it. This needs to be implemented. So you have to have a sharper eye on those sorts of aspects. In terms of commitments, I mean, I come from a national policy research and practice, actually, setting. It's always like that for any topic. This is always the tricky dance that you play. I mean, there's always within government at any point in time, right now, 10 years ago, 30 years ago, there's compromise. There's the need to compromise across different agencies. There's the need to compromise within agencies. Please don't take this the wrong way, but on some of the most difficult, wicked problems, as I've written about in terms of global irregular maritime migration, you are often looking for the least worst outcome. And to have people talk about the best is very useful to bring together a group of people to talk about the least worst. You need those NGOs, you need the advocates, you need those people. This is the best outcome because then that helps shift the discussion internally about the least worst, especially for really difficult. For easy kind of policy issues, you don't really need to think like that. But for the ones where you really do need to compromise and there's no silver bullet, as another piece of idiom, there's no simple, easy solution, being able to bring in best practice examples at a national level is very, very useful. I would say that the dynamics are actually quite different at the international level because it is aspirational in some respects. And to have those commitments that are aspirational, I think is very, very important, especially when we have some very significant immigration countries engaging in the public discourse and in the policy realm in quite a specific way at the moment. Careful language, but we know who we're talking about.
That was beautifully put, but I want to come back to that and perhaps less diplomatically later on in this discussion. And I have to say, from the perspective of the Migration Policy Institute, I agree that we need a spectrum of academia that goes from the philosophical to the policy focused. In Brussels, all we have are wicked problems right now. So find me an easy one, I would leap on it.